Let me recognize at the beginning of my comments that yesterday I was on the floor to talk about the incorporation of good forest policy as it relates to rejuvenating America's forests to increase their capability of sequestration of carbon out of the atmosphere. And I said that at that time there would be an amendment. That amendment has the co-sponsorship of Senator Domenici, Allard, Crapo, and Barrasso, and has been filed. It's an important amendment if we ever get to that phase of this debate where we will be able to effectively craft and shape a policy for our country. We deal with striking the international intent within this bill to take our money to help others for us before we help ourselves. We define biological sequestration. We think that's extremely important because we know how to do that now at the federal level. It's not the old business as usual model. It's establishing a baseline and being able to effectively measure from there. We allow forests to get credits for meaningful sequestration. And I think this is tremendously important to be able to do that. It's not about the volume of a stand of timber. It's about the ability of that stand to sequester. And if you have 400 trees per acre, you've overpopulated that area by as many as maybe 250 or 300 trees per acre. But that's the measurement of the Boxer Amendment. It is absolutely counterintuitive to modern forest science. We change it to where we are and where we know our forest scientists are today. We use existing monitoring and measuring tools. Very, very important. It's a product of 1992 legislation when we charged the U.S. Forest Service and their laboratories to get at the business of being able to effectively measure. We use international recognized sustainable forest management standards. We use RFS and productive tax credits for biomass and biomass removal. And of course, we use stewardship contracting, which is critically important. Now, Madam President, let me take you and those who might be listening today on a very interesting journey that starts at America's gas pump. Madam Chairman, let me assume that you've just driven up to a gas pump somewhere in America. You stick the hose in your car, you activate the pump, you slide your credit card, and you begin to fill. Depending on the size of your vehicle and the price, anywhere from $3.85 a gallon for regular to maybe $4.44 in California, you begin to grow annoyed as the calculator on the pump goes 35, 40, 45, 50, 55, 60, 65. Oops, you've maxed the pump and you have to get more by reactivating the pump to fill your SUV. Your anger is optimal now. You've just paid $100 or somewhere near that, and you've never done that before. And you move your view up to the pump and it says Chevron. It says Shell. It says one of the major oil companies, and you focus your anger on that company and you say, it's got to be their fault. They're making record profits. Somehow there ought to be a way to stop them from doing what they just did to me and my pocketbook and my family's budget. Let me take you, the consumer, then a step further and suggest to you that you are part of a problem that has been growing in America for a long while. Your demand for the use of energy has gone nearly straight up over 4 decades as you increased your consumption of it. Why? Because the price was reasonable and you enjoyed it. The price was reasonable and your demand went up dramatically. But while that was going on, there were interests at work in our country that said, we're not going to produce anymore. We're going to produce less. And we did. And our overall supply began to drop at about the time that our production began to, or that our demand began to go up catastrophically. What happened was an interesting scenario. So now you've hung your hose up from the gas pump. You've just paid $100. You're angry as heck. You're part of the demand curve in a supply in our country that's dropping down, and you've just blamed Exxon or Chevron or Marathon or someone because you've paid $100 to fill your SUV and you're not happy. If you took all of these small companies and blamed them all and said they've got to be the problem, they would only represent about 6 or 7% of the problem. The problem these companies have is that they're buying a substantial amount of their oil from this side of the chart. They're buying their oil from countries who don't give a darn about our problems. We've grown so dependent on foreign countries that now some 55 to 60% of our consumption comes from them. And we pay a phenomenal amount for it. Or should I say, you the consumer that's just put the hose on the gas pump up and have grown angry, wanting to focus your anger on these companies. Was it Canada you want to blame? Well, let's see now. At $120 a barrel, we're paying Canada $280 million a day. Why should we blame them? They're supplying our needs. There are no gas lines today. There is no diminishment in supply. It's a price problem. Well, then let's blame Saudi Arabia. Oh yeah, they're over here. They're the big boys. The president just went over there hat in hand begging that they would turn their valves on. And they went, no, Mr. President, your problem, not ours. You're going to keep buying our oil. You need it. We're paying them $190 million a day. Or maybe it's Venezuela, run by a little tin-horn dictator. $160 million a day flowing from our consumers' pocketbooks. Or it's Nigeria at $140 million. Or it's Algeria at $70 million. The bottom line is, well over $1 billion a day comes right out of the consumer's pocket and goes primarily to one of these companies that buys from one of these countries. And they buy the oil at the current world price. And they are allowed to take some profit from it. Sure they do. And their profits are record highs because the charges are record highs. And the story goes on and on. We search to blame. We have little alternatives. The business of the oil economy has little elasticity to it. We can't switch over to something else unless we park the SUV and get a bicycle. But you can't haul your kids to the soccer game on a bicycle. You can't haul boxes of groceries home on a bicycle. And so the American economy and its consumers are questioning itself right now, saying, what do we do? Let me suggest there is somebody to blame beside Exxon and Chevron and Marathon. Why don't you blame the United States Senate? Why don't you blame the Congress of the United States, who by being subject to environmental pressure over the last 30 years has largely denied the right of this country to effectively develop its oil reserves and create a less dependent relationship with all of these countries. That's what we ought to be doing, but we're not doing it. Here is a map of the Gulf region, of Florida and this region. We're developing this right now. We've just opened up this after we spent 2 years trying to get it open because politics would not allow us to open it. And we think there are about 2.2 million barrels a day starting in 2012 down here. This is lease sale 181. But over here, there may be as much oil as there was or is here. But this is politically off limits. We can't do it. Why shouldn't the consumers say, well, what's the politics of it? You're draining my pocketbook dry. Is there value in that politics? Why don't you develop your reserves? Well, Florida, presidential politics, you name it. Floridians go, well, they just are awfully frustrated by the fact that you might be able to drill there. This area right down here is the Cuban Basin, northern Cuban Basin. Cubans are letting leases out to drill there. U.S. Geological Survey would suggest that there is some oil there, maybe quite a bit of oil. But But we won't get it. It won't traffic through Exxon or Chevron because we have a policy that denies us access to that region of the world because, if you will, of the politics of Cuba, plain and simple. So here's our problem with that, and here's our problem with this interesting picture. We have about 115 billion barrels of reserve in gas. About 29 billion known, about 85 billion undiscovered resources. In gas, we have about 633 trillion cubic feet, 213 trillion known, 419 unknown. Now that's information that is 20 years old, because politically you dare not go out into any of these regions today with the new seismic technology and explore, because if you did and you found oil, you might want to drill, and that would be environmentally unacceptable. Oh, how frightening. I remember a time, and not all do, unless you're about my age, come 1969, when there was an interesting oil spill off the coast of Santa Barbara in Southern California. It made national headlines because it was one of the first major oil spills that did substantial environmental damage. I have oftentimes referred on the floor to our denial to access the outer continental shelf as the ghost of Santa Barbara that lurk in these chambers and hide in the background of environmental arguments. That was Santa Barbara, 1969. But what is fascinating about Santa Barbara is that while we didn't drill offshore Santa Barbara because of a moratorium in the federal waters, we continued to drill offshore Santa Barbara in the state waters. And today, offshore Santa Barbara, California is producing 731,000 barrels of oil a day. They just cut a new deal with some oil companies to drill in this area. Well, why aren't they allowing us to drill offshore further out in the continental shelf? Because California doesn't get the money. Oops, sorry folks, money trumped the environment. Remember that. In Santa Barbara today, they're drilling for oil if it's within the 3-mile limit of the shoreline, because that's state oil and that's state water. But out in the Federal Reserve, outer continental shelf, no, can't do, must not do, something about a problem. Well, what the ghost of Santa Barbara and the 1969 oil spill did was shove us into a period of technology unprecedented. And today we are drilling offshore in the Gulf in the waters so deep that we didn't even imagine a decade ago we could be there. We're doing it appropriately in a very, very clean fashion. So here are the headlines in Los Angeles, April 20, 2008, Santa Barbara approves offshore drilling. Well, what happened to this picture here? What happened in 1969 with this oil rig spilling oil, sea lions dying, fish dying, muck, oily muck along the shoreline? That's Santa Barbara, 1969. We were led to believe they stopped drilling altogether, but they didn't. They just approved new drilling, but it's inside the 3-mile zone. Now, Californians are selective, apparently, about their environment. If there's money tied to it, well, maybe we can drill, if we get all the money. But if we don't get as much of it, we won't drill offshore. And that's kind of the politics that's gone on today. So remember how I started these comments a few moments ago? You just driven up to a gas pump. You just stuck the nozzle in the tank of your SUV. You just cranked out $100 worth of regular at about $4.40 a gallon in California because of the boutique fuels of the Clean Air Act. And you'd grown angry because somebody was ripping you off. And that somebody had to be an Exxon or a Chevron or a Marathon or someone else. But I hope I've been able to suggest to you some additional knowledge, that they represent maybe 6% of world production. It's the petropolitics of the world today where nearly 90% of the known oil and the reserves are owned by foreign nations who are sticking it to us. And they're sticking it to us today because of our own interesting greed. Because we grew luxuriously fat on cheap energy. And we developed cars that take a lot. And now that we can't fill them for $20 and it's costing us $100, we're angry and we want to blame somebody. So blame Saudi Arabia, blame Venezuela, but how about blaming us here in the Congress? Because some of us have tried, but the body politics of America denied that we should touch our own reserves, that we should develop our own oil, that we should become dependent on someone else. And so we have legislation on the floor today that doesn't help that. It creates, in fact, greater dependency. It doesn't move us forward to develop those known reserves. It doesn't allow us to do the geological exploration in the deep waters of the outer continental with the new technologies in which we will find much more oil than we know is there. America, blame your Congress, blame your friendly congressman or your friendly senator. Ask them how they voted. Ask them how they're going to vote on ANWR, on outer continental shelf, on new development, on new refinery capacity. Oil is not the answer for 50 years from now, but oil is the bridge that gets us from where we are to where we need to be with new technologies. But our lack of foresightedness, our rush to be green, our rush to deny the realities of the marketplace have produced the problems we have today. And there are people to blame. And we ought to start right here with a Congress that would not listen. Year after year, while I and others brought ANWR to the floor for a vote, while we tried to get into the outer continental shelf, and politically, it was simply an unpopular thing to do, because some would say that this would be the picture. Fellow senators, this is the picture of the past. This is 1969 Santa Barbara. From that day forward, we began to apply technology to drill heads, to drill rigs, to our capability and our talent. And when Katrina hit the Gulf, and Katrina hit the coastline of Louisiana and parts of Alabama and Florida, offshore, not one drop was spilled. Thousands of wells were shut down. Rigs were sent adrift. But this did not occur. And this will not occur again because of the triple safety devices and all the kinds of things that have been incorporated as a result of this. And so California today drills happily away within the 3-mile zone because they get 100%. But outside the 3-mile zone, no, can't touch, might hurt the environment. Shame on us. I yield the floor.